This is Anastasia Kuznetsova interviewing Ryszard Newton Reich on 14th of May 2018 at his home in Moseley. Ryszard was born in Bobrowniki nad Wisła in Poland in 1944. He migrated to Birmingham in 1946. Ryszard, describe the place in which you were born.
Bobrowniki is a tiny village on the river Wisła, which of course is better known as Vistula, the major river of Poland. It is primarily an agricultural area, but at the time of my birth it was part of occupied Nazi Germany, and it was on a borderline between two SS sections of Poland. I think one was run by somebody called Herr Frank, and the other one was run by somebody called Herr Forster. Now, one of these people was made very liberal with Germanizing Poles, so they would offer them what they called Volksdeutsch. And of course, for a lot of people, it was either Volksdeutsch or Auschwitz. So some of my relatives took Volksdeutsch. My mother didn't, but then she had to wear a yellow triangle with a P over it. The Jews had the six-pointed star, which everybody's aware of, but Poles had a triangle with a P over it, which mother had to wear. She worked on a farm. In fact, the family might have owned it, but of course owning things didn't mean anything in Nazi Germany because it all belonged to the SS. Or they had an organisation called the Einsatzgruppen, who were basically SS thugs that were ostensibly sent to weed out Jews and send them to concentration camps. But sometimes they weren't terribly fussy who they shot or who they sent to these camps. So mother would say that it was a nuisance when the Einsatzgruppen were around, especially when they were drunk. And then the other problem we had to put up with was the gunfire, because Bobrowniki was in the path of a thing called Operation Bagration, by which the Russians were chasing the Germans back into Germany, and it was sort of their trip to Berlin. And of course, Germans would shoot at them and they would shoot at Germans, and so you heard this horrible thudding all the time. And since this was very likely the first thing I heard when I was little, it explains why I detest music which has got heavy drumming or thudding in it. The other thing which the Russians used to send to the Germans were rockets. I think they were sent from rails of rockets called Stalin barrel organs or something. And these made a horrible wail as they went over. So I also cannot stand shrieking, high-pitched pop singing, probably because of that. So I had to survive the last 8 months of this war when I was little. At the same time, at the other end of Europe, was a battle called the Battle of the Bulge, which was pretty nasty. So it wasn't really an area or a time that you could do very much in. Dad was a prisoner of war. He was one who didn't get off at Dunkirk because he was told to stay behind and stop the Germans. And so, of course, when the last of the 330,000 got off, it was a tap on the shoulder, and it was, "Herr Tommy, for you the war is over." And so they took him off to Poland to a concentration camp. And that's where he met mother, because they were both on slave labour details, and I was the result. Of course, after that, we spent about a year in Poland, because I don't know, there's about 60 million displaced people. And so we had to go to the local Suchdienst, or the lost people desk, to find missing relatives and so on. The Germans called it the Suchdienst. But of course we were more or less just sort of kept there. We were living quite happily because we were on a farm, so rationing didn't really kick in because my mother's elders were able to grow their own stuff and preserve it, because that was a skill lots of Poles had, even 40 years later. So the next thing was to get back to England, because Daddy was a serving soldier, and so I was sort of made British, and then we went back in a plane. Now they had lots of Lancasters and things which they didn't need for bombing cities anymore, so they used those for repatriating POWs and soldiers. I can't remember what I was flying in because I was only little. But when I got to Birmingham, I found that it was a lot less pretty than Bobrowniki. But of course, Birmingham got bombed. Bobrowniki didn't really, because it was only a tiny village, so they just go past that. But of course, some of my relatives, my English relatives, were very much in the front line because they worked at the GEC in Witton, and they had to make bits and pieces for Spitfires in a place called Castle Bromwich Aerodrome, which is today's Castlevale Estate. And of course, the Germans kept bombing places like the GEC, so they were pretty well in the front line as well. Although they would be considered in reserved occupations because they were skilled tool makers. A tool maker is a person who makes the jigs and things that enable you to shape the parts of the engines that go into these planes. And so, of course, my mother and myself, we were sort of foreigners there. But not that foreign, because a lot of people who flew Spitfires were Polish. So England was no stranger to Poles. I think there's a Polish club on Gravelly Hill to this day, which might have started then. But you see, we had to learn English, myself and my mother, without being taught it, because our family elders used to say silly things like, "Oh, why do you want to marry a foreigner?" And of course, it was rationing. That was something we weren't exactly well off in Poland because we were growing our own food, but we couldn't get any of the things you couldn't grow. So in Birmingham, though, everything was on ration. Mother would queue for hours just to get eggs for me because they were good for you. Looking back on it, the health people would say we didn't dine particularly healthily, but it's more unhealthy to dine not at all, because that means you end up dead pretty soon. It's called starvation, which Mother saw plenty of in Poland. And of course, while waiting in these queues, Mother would sometimes smack me across the back of the legs. And 60 years later, she would sort of say, "You don't think that was child abuse, do you?" "No, not at all." I said, it's better to be hurt at the back of the legs than 32 foot long and 1/4 of an inch thick being splattered by a number 65 bus, because she was doing it for me running out into the road. And so, of course, we would wait for ages in queues, and little children don't respond well to that. They do run about. And I did my fair share of that. And of course, in Civvy Street, back in Mufti again, my dad was a carpenter and builder. And of course, that was where I started to learn carpentry, by watching him work. And in 1947, I had a brother. Now, the brother was English born. He was a Brummie, but he was called Włodzimierz, which of course is the Polish version of Vladimir. And now, of course, none of the English relatives could pronounce it. So they used to call him Wardek or Warwick. So he was stuck with a Polish name he couldn't pronounce. And he always proclaimed himself as a Brummie, right through to the end of his days. He was sort of, I was the firstborn, so fathers expected firstborn to be just like them, like dinky toy scale models of them or Airfix models of them. But I wasn't. I was more of Mummy's boy, and Daddy used to call me that, meaning to be insulting. Oh, I said, no, I'm not insulted at all. Mother talks sense. That was usually enough to get you a clip across the ear. So my brother was really Daddy's son, because he cottoned on to everything. He took up things like smoking and drinking and so on. And of course, we were living in Erdington, so all these pictures of Balsall Heath of 50 and 60 years ago, I saw more or less the same in Erdington 50 or 60 years ago. Of course, in Erdington you had Brookie Park, which was quite a big lake in it, and a bandstand, and a bowling green and stuff like that. And we lived in a road called George Road. Because of the housing shortage, it was usually, I think we lived with about 3 other families there. And the thing which I found most revolting was, of course, a meat shortage as well. So the people next door would often grab something, kill it, and butcher it in the back garden, which I found quite revolting. So we were always finding bones thrown over into our side of the garden. And so I wasn't particularly impressed with my experiences of Birmingham then. And then, of course, we got bicycles. 2 presents I appreciated was a Meccano Set 5 and a bicycle. The Meccano Set 5 is a much more sophisticated construction kit than the best Lego you can get these days, and you had to have an engineer's mind to make anything with it. And the bicycle was great, because the old man said, oh, well, you got bloody bikes now, you can learn to ride them. So we had to go around Brookie Park with these bicycles. And he was looking at his watch. He'd say, oh, I don't know how long this is going to last. I want to get to the pub. And so, of course, he'd hurry us along. And because I was a bit slow, he used to thump me. And so I learned to ride the bike pretty quick, because when the last time he did it, I took off like a rocket. And I thought, whoopee, I can ride a bike. I can get away from this goddamn place. And I did. Of course, it was quite laughable, really, because in those days they had trams. And, of course, nobody could ride a bicycle without getting their wheels stuck in the tram lines. And I observe a mere 65 years later, you can do the same thing again with the modern trams, which look exactly or more or less like the trams we had in Poland, Germany and Czechoslovakia. So that's how modern they look. So once I was able to ride the bicycle, I would go riding all over the place and get lost all over the place. I would go 5 miles out from home and then get reported as missing and dragged back by the police. And then I'd get thumped by the old man. Of course, in those days, it was fairly commonplace But Daddy used to have leather belts with iron buckles on them. Well, I think my daddy had a bronze buckle, so that could be called luxury. If you got a toweling from a belt with a bronze buckle instead of an iron one. But then, of course, we soon had the house to ourselves. So the old man did his carpentry there. Mother would sit in the pantry under the stairs, polishing screw heads for the GEC to make pin money. It wasn't war work by then. It was just making extra money because we weren't exactly rich. And then, of course, the big break came when Daddy had a choice of either going to Oxfordshire or a place called Uganda. And of course, we sort of did a bit of research on where Uganda was, right next door to Kenya. Oh, great. If you went to Uganda in 1954 or 55, you'd get murdered by Mau Mau terrorists. So that didn't exactly appeal. So he went for Oxfordshire instead. And there, I think, we built 250 council houses in a lovely part of the country, which was so much unlike Birmingham that even 6 decades later I remember it well. And of course I had the bike and all those lovely roads, and I made good use of them. But I didn't get lost. I was better at navigating. And of course I had this younger brother. Now he did all the normal little boy things like playing cowboys and Indians and stuff like that, and reading comics. His was the Dandy, mine was the Beano. But he played with the other kids in the area. I didn't. I watched what the men were doing, taking in all the things on how to do bricklaying, how to do plumbing, how to do electrical wiring, and how to read the surveying instruments like the dumpy level and the theodolite. For a 10-year-old, that would be considered quite good. In fact, if I taught Pavli and Oscar to read these instruments at that sort of age, but you see, it was the mathematics we had to do with it. That was the tough thing. And so I took up all these skills. I wasn't matey with these workmen. I watched what they were doing, and then they'd let me have a go at it. And of course, during holidays, because I was able to work out the levels and angles for setting out the houses when I was about 10 or 11, I got quite lucrative holiday jobs in the school holidays. So after a 6-week holiday, I would come away with as much as £25. In today's money, that's nearly £500. And I say this to Oscar, this is what they don't teach you in history at school, is the economic and cost of living index. So I said, right, it's like you being able to do these hard maths I'm doing with you. It's like you being able to do them, and in 6 weeks being able to count 500 quid pocket money. He did get more interested in mathematics after that. But you see, the only problem was I could afford to buy things like cameras and tape recorders. So you'd go into a shop, a camera shop, and of course, to the shopkeeper, you're only a little kid, a snotty-nosed kid. And I'd say, right, can I buy this camera? It's £25. And you'd produce the money, 5 crisp £5 notes. All right, son, where did you nick that? So even being rich had a lot of problems. And then, of course, there was the old man. He would borrow money from mother for beer and cigarettes. And then, of course, he would say, oh, I know, Richard's got money. He never spends it. He's too tight. So he'd come to me and he'd say, you got a couple of quid to go out? Oh, no, I put it in the bank. I said, no, you bloody well haven't. I didn't see you go into the bank. So I thought, drat. So I said, oh, he said, who got you this job then? Well, you did, Daddy. So I got the money out, said, don't strain yourself reaching for your wallet, will you? So, of course, I was incessantly lending money to the old fella doing that. And one of my diary entries says, not long after that, Daddy owes me £37 10 and 4pence. That's 800 quid in today's money. It's laughable. But it had a positive outcome, because in the end, he said, well, don't let me catch you smoking or drinking just now, but when you're 16, you've got to be able to do it, to be a man, my lad. I said, don't worry, I don't think I'll bother. Why? It's too expensive. And to that, I stuck by that. And so I never smoked or drunk. But of course, whilst Brother Stanley played with the kiddies, with cowboys and Indians, I went out on the bicycle. So I'd think nothing of going 13 miles to Oxford to do shopping. But mind you, that was quite tough, because I was never particularly fit in the way that Oscar is. And my longest bike ride, I think, was about 34 miles, and that nearly creased me. So I thought, yeah, well, I'll take it easy. But I think I did about 1,500 miles on the bike just doing that, and seeing all this lovely Oxfordshire countryside. Then, of course, some of the older kids would come rolling cigarettes and lighting them, and they'd say, these cigarettes are no good, they get wet halfway up. I said, well, you don't smoke them properly, I said. Could you show us how to smoke them? Oh, very well, so I did. So you sort of hold them like that and so on. Do you want a cigarette? No, thank you, I said. I have a pipe myself, because I was reading Tom Sawyer at the time. But of course the tobacco they used to get was a bit strange, because sometimes they used to get it through the fence from the American air base, and that was weird. And I didn't like it, because it made you sort of sick and made your head swim. So I sort of gave up on that. Of course, the other thing I got censure for was consorting with girls. Not in the way that, not at the age of 11, not in the way that most people think, but these wanted to know about how to do carpentry and how to lay bricks and build houses. So they'd ask me to show them. So I'd go to a stack of bricks and show them the various bricklaying bonds. And I used to get clobbered by the old man for that. He'll say, playing with girls, that's Sissy's work, my lad. I was, what am I supposed to do then? He says, well, you've got lots of boys you can play with. Yes, I said, but they're so damn boring, because all they can talk about is football, Stanley Matthews and Don Bradman and cricket and all that rubbish. So I was always going to be different from the start. But of course, by the time I was 11 or so, I could wire up a house and I could plumb. I could put in sinks and toilets. And in those days, I mean, these days it's a semi-skill, because you just have to flip a rubber grommet over some of these things. In those days, we had to make a string-like thing and then impregnate it with red lead paste and then bolt it between two galvanised steel fittings. That was to connect a toilet pan to a flush pipe, which was usually made of lead. So it was a completely different world. But of course I knew how to do it. And I didn't realise that 60 years later I'd be teaching little children how to do these things, but with much friendlier wires, fittings and pipes and so on. And I mean, I was teaching this at posh prep schools in East Anglia, teaching these rich kids how to plumb in a wash basin and so on. So of course after Oxfordshire, Daddy got the strange idea of going to Canada, because in those years the shipping lines were really trying to plug tickets, emigration tickets, to fill the ships to go across. And so he fell for that one. And so we went to Canada. He wasn't very well prepared for it. The place we lived in Toronto wasn't that nice. It was okay. It was better than the George Roadhouse. But then you see, he decided he wanted to go back because Stanley had to go to grammar school. He had to pass his 11 plus. I failed mine. And of course got incessantly told off about it. But I had the last laugh there as well. I failed it because I didn't bother with the what I call monkey puzzle tests, the IQ tests. I just put a line through them. And then of course later on I said, well, this is a silly setup for gauging intelligence anyway, because the guy who invented it was discredited. His findings were discredited. And so he caused a lot of misery to a lot of people who didn't get into grammar school. So we said, oh, it doesn't matter. I want you to study plumbing. And I want your brother to study company law, because he's going to a grammar school now. Of course, from there we went to Wales, where we had to put up 750 houses at the top end of the Rhondda Valley. In other words, the bit between the coal mines and the Brecon Beacons. Now, the Brecon Beacons was lovely for walking over. And so, again, more experience of wide open spaces. But of course, lots of hills meant the cycle trips were shorter. But of course, after that, Daddy dragged us back to Birmingham because he wanted to cash in on the 60s multi-storey blocks of flats thing. And at the time they were building the thing called the Rotunda. Now, the funny thing was, with my education in Wales, Stanley went to his grammar school, no trouble at all. He passed the 11 plus and went to his grammar school, which was a castle-shaped one called Cyfarthfa Castle. But of course, I was dumped at a secondary school while the builder was about to collect drain pipes. So then the headmaster said, well, no, you're only 12, but you know a lot more than anybody in the school, so you can choose your lessons. Great, I said. So I ditched all things like geography, because I knew more of it than they did anyway, and religious studies and games and PE, and got extra lessons in woodwork and metalwork. And some of the time he would send me down the road to the technical college for the extra metalwork, where I was using state-of-the-art industrial machines. So that's where I learned a lot of the stuff I teach the kids now, the engineering stuff. And when I went to visit Stanley's grammar school, I thought, God, how boring this is. I'm glad I didn't go to a grammar school. But of course, when I got to Birmingham again, I was sent to the GEC, which of course my dad didn't like anyway, which is why he went on the buildings. But all my English family were at GEC. So, of course, I then had to spend 3 nights a week traipsing from Whitton to Great Bar to do night school stuff. And, of course, that's how I got my O-levels and A-levels and a little qualification in electrical engineering. And, of course, Stanley was the one expected to get O-levels and A-levels. I got more than he did. But it was hard work. I mean, you were working from 7:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock at night, and then you still had to traipse across Birmingham to do the studies. And I got pretty fed up of that. But then, of course, the old man decided to go to Sutton Coldfield. And, of course, in those days, you could buy a detached 3-bedroomed house for £2,500, which he did. And of course, that meant I had a long trip to go to the GEC. And that was nice. Sutton Coldfield was nicer than Erdington. I can see why the houses cost more. But the first thing he did was knock it about to put extra bedrooms in it, which I thought, I don't mind because I can do most of these things. But of course I then had 2 more little brothers, and of course they were sleeping in a bedroom which had an 8-foot gap in the floor, a 2.5 metre gap between the end of the floor and the new wall. So if they took one false step, they'd end up downstairs in a flat state. So, of course, we did all that stuff, and that was where I started building boats. So I got the boat design and started building a 9-metre sailing yacht. And it was a landmark in the front garden for about 3 years before we took it away to launch it. And that, of course, was where I got the boat building skills, which I now teach the kids in the print works. But, of course, so far, Oscar's the only one who's taken it up to a viable extent of producing a boat that you can actually sail on the water. I did so with the school children in East Anglia, and we did quite a bit of sailing on it. The thing about the influence Birmingham had on me was most noticeable when I did go to East Anglia, because Birmingham trained me as a teacher at its expense to do secondary teaching, 11 to 16s. So I was one of the people from industry trained like that. And of course, I thought, I don't like the secondary. I hated secondary school anyway, when I was at one. So I thought, yeah, I think this stuff would go down very well with primary children. So at the end of it, when I got my teacher's ticket, one of the fellows said, I think it was one of the officers said, right, what are your career plans? Oh, I said, I shall teach primary. You can't, it's a woman's world. We don't have men in primary schools. I said, I had sort of noticed that. He said, if you might even think of going into private education. What a good idea, I said. I might well think of that. He said, well, if you do, no state school will touch you with a barge pole. I said, considering the kind of inner city dump you're about to send me to, that is no great loss. So I served my time, chucked in my resignation, and went to an interview at a private school near Bury St Edmunds. And this was in a 160-acre private estate. It was a boys' boarding school, 3 to 13, so it wasn't secondary. And so the headmaster showed me around the place. He said, of course, you've got to design your own workshop in the stable block. Oh, I said, that shouldn't be a problem. And then he said, what about football? What do you think? I detest the game, I said. Oh, well, that would have been on your timetable. Oh, I said, if I have to teach it, I will. I mean, my subject is design and technology and problem solving. So I will find a way to solve that problem. Oh, well, very well. We can take it off the timetable if you really don't want it. Well, I said, no, keep it on. Let's see how I get on first. So do you know anything about computers? Because this was when computers were just coming in. Yes, I said, I know which computers are worth getting and good value for money and which ones aren't. He said, well, don't ask for another bloody BBC because the one we've got costs £1,000. Oh, sir, I said, for that sort of money, I could get you 5 computers with built-in disk drives, which are as useful. However, he took us round the estate, and then in the end, he took us into the drawing room, where we sort of had tea and biscuits. And he said, any questions, Mr. Newton? Well, yes, I said. One would have thought that an august establishment of this nature would have gone more for the ex-Cambridge Rugby 15 captain or the rowing 8. Oh, no, Mr. Newton, it's your Birmingham skills we want. And so it came to good effect. So I set up the woodwork at the place. The older kids, 8 to 13s, only did woodwork because their main task was to study to pass the common entrance exam to get into schools like Eton and Harrow and Oundle and so on. But the younger kids, I was doing with wood and metal. And he did say, would you care to go down to 5 years old? I'll give it a try, I said. So I did, and it worked. And then, of course, go down to 2.5 years old. Yeah, that worked as well. And I've been doing it ever since for over 3 decades. So all this stuff was distilled into that. And the thing was, to develop anything in East Anglia, to buy equipment and so on, you have to travel so far. You had to go to Ipswich or Norwich or Cambridge. So any of these trips was 40, 50, 60-mile round trip. Now, of course, being back in Birmingham, I could get all these things all around me, which was why it was much quicker to do the workshop in the print works than it was to set up the workshops in the school. Now, of course, the funny thing was, that school was where I developed this stuff, and the school had a house in France. And so I thought, yes, well, I'm just a woodwork teacher, basically. So it's not really going to have much to do with me. So the headmaster got us all in the staff room and said, well, right, we have to try and build in French into our subjects. That makes sense, I said, because we're in Europe, and I do believe in a wider view of the world than just England and Great Britain, myself coming from Poland. So the other teachers didn't like it, but they had to do it because the gaffer said so. So he then turned to me. I said, me? I teach woodwork. You can't really connect it with French. He says, Herr Newton, you will find a way of putting French into your woodwork or you will be shot, sort of thing. So, yes, sir. Right. So I did. I submitted a plan, and he looked at it and says, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, these are babies. I said, sir, you only asked me to submit a plan, not run a trip. I said, well, you can bloody well run the trip. I said, very well. So I did, And of course, after 13 hours on the road and 360 miles of driving and car ferries, little Duncan started blubbing. And the headmaster turned round, because he did have military background. Says, now look here, we're going to make men of you, so no blubbing. And I said, sir, if you wish to relieve me of my command forthwith, then do so. But I won't have that sort of thing on my trip. He says, oh, I don't know how you could possibly have patience with these babies. At least you can talk to my 13-year-olds. Yes, if you've really got nothing better to do. And of course, 2 days later, he said, I can't believe it. Your rapport with these little ones is remarkable. Have you ever thought of making a career move out of it? So I did. I studied Montessori 3 to 6. And that, again, was built into this. But with a lot more technology. So some of my Montessori, I developed Montessori exercises using engineering equipment. And to this day, you will never see exercises like that in the Colombo Montessori school down the road there, because it's still all pouring beans and things and clipping clothes pegs round baskets. So I thought, right, let's see how these exercises can be upgraded into the world of technology. So we take crocodile clips attached to wires, and the kids need more dexterity to attach a crocodile clip to a terminal than to stick a clothes peg on a basket. And so the Montessori lecturer said, that's very good, really. You should have it as an exercise. There's a slight difference, I said. In the Montessori sense, the kid has passed if the clip stays on the terminal, like if the clothes peg stays on the basket and doesn't flick off the basket, then it's a pass. I said, but for my CDTX or CDT exercise, when he presses the button, the circuit has got to work. So he's not just clipping crocodile clips onto voltage rails and terminals. The circuit that he's connecting up a circuit, and it has to work. And I've got pictures of kids doing this in my workshop. And we did the same with pneumatics. So we have industry standard push-in connections. And so if you connect up the pneumatics, the 3-2 valve and the cylinder, you can either connect it to the air tank, which you then have to pressurize with a hand pump, which is hard work and good exercise for the kids, or you can plug it into what was then the school's own 10-bar air supply. But then, of course, when you press the valve, the cylinder had to work. So you see, you had this extra layer of logic, which they had to master to be successful at it. Of course, a lot of the teachers for that age group, they thought this was too much for small children. Small children need to play. Yeah, very true. That's why we have playtime. But they also need to work, because that's how they develop their intellect and their knowledge. Of course, as the headmaster said to me, when one of my colleagues, the one in charge of 5 to 6 year olds, was incessantly saying how dangerous my workshop is and how the stuff I teach is too difficult. The headmaster said, well, you've got to remember her mathematical skills are not quite up to yours. Well, that's reasonable, I said. But in the end, I thought it's ever so easy for me to say the stuff they do in class is too simple. If the kids worked at the level they did in CDT all the time, that is about 5 years ahead of what they were doing, they'd be stressed out. So when they finish my lesson, they go back to to the class teacher's lesson doing the basics. So if they did that all the time, they'd get bored out of their prams, as many kids do in schools. So what we had was this slow lane, fast lane method, which was developed. And I got my master's degree for that. That is recycling Birmingham engineering skills as a child development vehicle. It hasn't caught on because a lot of people in the education sector do not have the practical engineering skills. When you learn this stuff in teacher training, you're taught all the airy-fairy stuff about the impact of technology on society, the latest computers and latest hardware and software devices, and how you can stream things off the internet. But that isn't everything, is it? And of course, I'm censured by a lot of people. Because computers and IT was my second subject. And I taught kids how to build PCs and how to set them up, how to set up printers and hardware and software. And then, of course, I was censured because I didn't use the internet. Ah, yes, I said. The modern computer isn't a computer at all. It's merely a glorified telephone because it's a communication device. That means you have to have something or someone at the other end of a communication line to do anything with it. There is nothing you do which is creative on it, or at least most kids I've seen. They just stream things or download them. Whereas we taught children how to use computers to produce art, to do word processing, to do desktop publishing, that is text and pictures mixed, and to compose music. And we taught composition. We taught music composition as a computer programming language because all of the things you can divide a musical piece into is the same as you can divide the sections of a basic program, a command line program into. So you can say, right, section A, and then repeat while, when, repeat until, then go to section B, and you can grab sections of music, invert it, process it, call it section B, and assemble all these things, because you see there are musicians' names for them. An ABA would be called ternary form, which Mozart, Beethoven and all those, a word they would have known. And ABAB, binary form. And Mozart actually wrote a waltz, a do-it-yourself waltz kit. If he had computers in his day, it would have been a computer, do-it-yourself computer waltz. But in his day, he had cards of sections of the music which you could juxtapose and then play. So you see, this stuff goes back quite a long way. The thinking behind it goes a long way, and it's the thinking that I had in mind. A musical notation is more useful as a programming device because you can at least listen to your program. And so we had the average age of composer was about 7.5, and the music director didn't like it at all, so he complained to the headmaster. He grabbed one of the kids by the collar and dragged him to the headmaster, and he took the sheaf of music off him, about 4 sheets of it, and he said, "What's this music? I've never seen this piece before, yet it's printed out and everything." And the headmaster sent for me and he said, "All right, Newton, what have you been up to now?" I said, "What? This music? Ah, your children composed it," I said. "Don't you think you're sort of showing a lack of respect for your colleague here in his subject?" "Not at all," I said, "because this isn't music. this is information technology, which, as you have timetabled me for, is my second subject. It ain't music until somebody picks up an Android interface called an instrument and plays it. And the headmaster said, that's good enough for me. And of course the thing was, the school liked entering children in the Suffolk Festival of music and dance, and poetry and stuff. I don't really like things like that because it puts pressure on children, as I could hear from the tortured screams of the ones learning poetry and stuff for it. But their parents wanted to enter them into it. So I said, well, if your parent enters you for these things, then I have to do my best to give you support for it. And so we entered 3 kids in the under 16 composition class. And we went along, and one of them, the youngest one, climbed onto the rostrum. And the organiser said, could you get that brat off the rostrum? Because we need it for the next entrant. I said, sir, he is your next entrant. Can't be. How old is he? Well, I said, he'll soon be 4. So he set the computer up to play his composition. And they scratched their heads at it and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And then the other 2 kids did with theirs. One of them wrote a complete first movement of his own symphony because he used all the Haydn type rules of how to write a symphony and produced his version of it. And another one produced a Spanish style dance which he called a welder's dance. And the adjudicator said, well, why a welder's dance? And little Christopher said, well, when you get a spark down your shoe, you dance. Yes, I suppose you do. So this was 1, 2, 3. The rostrum, the podium position, 1, 2, 3. Gold, silver, bronze. The first was 7 years old, second was 6 years old, and third was 4 years old. And in fact, they had a go at the education system. They said it's disgusting that an under 16 category should have children this young winning it. What are you doing at your schools in music? So we had a bit of a laugh over that. Basically, it didn't really catch on. It hasn't really caught on here because most of the people in these areas, their religion forbids them to do it. And so I got rather fed up of this once, so I said, okay, when I taught music composition, the first thing I did was deconstruct any cultural things, any cultural connections, because musical notation or music is mathematics. So I then showed this one parent to prove it. I said, each note on the piano, forget the 8 notes, that's a special case. Each note on a piano for the 12 notes is 2 to the power 1/12 higher than the one before it. So if you go from C to C through all the 12 notes, each one is 2 to the 1/12 times the note before it. So if you take the frequency of the note before it as 256 and the C next as 512, then you can arrive at this quite easily, because with indices, with powers of numbers, you add the indices. And so if you add 1/12 12 times, you end up with 1. Now, of course, anything to the power 0 logarithmically is 1. And anything to the power 1 is itself. So therefore, by the time you get to the next C, it's twice the frequency of the one before. Ergo, it is mathematics. As to the 8-note scale, that is an occurrence of the harmonic series as developed by Pythagoras. So I forget the formula for it, but you can produce a mathematical one for it. Because as I teach brass as well, if you start on a trumpet, you've got C, G, the next C, the next E above it, which is a major third, the next G above the E, which is a minor third, and then a B flat above the G, which is another minor third, but the next one above that is a C. And if you go higher than that, you get a diatonic scale of 8 notes with the semitones in between, note 3 and 4, and 7 and 8. But of course, by the time you've got that high on a trumpet, you need a road drill compressor to blow it, which is, of course, why valves were invented. So I said there's nothing cultural about it. It's scientific and mathematical. The cultural stuff is what you invest it with. That's why I'm the least popular person around.
Thank you so much. Can I please ask you some last questions?
Right.
Do you still come back to Poland?
I've been back about 4 times. I have difficulty with the language now because if you spoke Polish in the 40s or the 50s, you got into trouble. Not with the children, but with the adults, the family elders and the teachers at the school. The teachers at the school, of course, they were prize clowns because, you see, as a foreign person, I kept getting the same mathematics cards to do all the time because they assumed that I wasn't clever enough, so I could only do the simple cards. So the girl next to me swapped her cards because she couldn't do them. But she did the cards that I had, so I did her cards. And for that, the teacher sort of said, "Ah, Richard, that's swapping cards. That's very naughty. Hold out your hand." Whack with the cane. "Have you anything to say, Richard?" "Yes," I said. "I shall beat your lot at your language and mathematics and science." And I went on to do it. I got another slash of the cane for saying that. And then, of course, we were asked to bring books in to read. And, of course, in those days, there was a thing called beacon readers, which is sort of like the lowest level of Ladybird books. I don't know, do Ladybird books exist anymore? They did in the 70s. No, it's even worse these days because lots of parents are buying Ladybird books because they were better written. However, I brought in a thing called the MAC catalogue. It was a builder's catalogue from the metal agencies in Bristol. And it advertised all sorts of building and civil engineering products. And of course, it had worded descriptions of them. And of course, the words in them were way ahead of anything in these readers. So as soon as I produced the book, she said, "You can't read that. I don't understand it, so you won't." I said, "Please, miss, I do." So I got the stick again. Mother wasn't very impressed. So we sort of went to the headmaster about it and I got put into another class. So you see, the word racism wasn't coined in those days, but that's what it was.
Last question. What is your relationship with Poland now?
I still have family there, but I'm not familiar with the current generation of them because that was a long time ago. And some of them are in Russia, some of them went to America. So my family was subject to a diaspora, which of course is the Greek word for where we English get the word dispersion from. So they were sort of dispersed all over the place, like America, Australia and so on. So I've lost touch with them. And of course I'm excommunicated from my English family.
What is your favourite Polish dish?
Kapusta and Krakowska, which is sort of sauerkraut with Polish sausage. And that is nice. Dobre smakuje, as they would say.
Do you have any favourite Polish traditions?
I wasn't really old enough to notice them. Well, we like playing Polish music, and when we had a Polish visitor to the school, she sang a song in Polish, and of course I noted it down, and noted down the key as well. And to this day, even Louis has taught the kids to play it on the violin. So, of course, I was never really set up for doing arts, because I went through all the engineering and building stuff. And once I knew enough of that to be capable of building houses and boats and things, I then looked at music and art and literature. So I wrote 3 books based on my thesis, and I'm working on a novel which sort of encapsulates what it's like being a misfit. I have surpassed 6 million word mark on that. And to this day, one of my younger brothers refers to me as illiterate because I don't read many books. Which is true, because the only books I ever read were information books. When I was reading bedtime stories to Oscar and Pavs, I read more books doing that, more non-fiction books, more fiction books doing that than I ever did in the sort of 65 years before.
Last question. Describe Birmingham in 3 words.
I wouldn't be able to. It is too many things to describe in only 3 words because it depends on what aspect. It's certainly handy because I can get the tools and materials and stuff. It's handy because it taught me the skills that I now teach to the children. So it's a useful sort of place. It's handy. As for being picturesque, I couldn't really use words like that because I've only spent about 30 something years in Birmingham because I was 25 years in East Anglia, and of course for some of my time in Birmingham I was at a place called Canwell, which is sort of out in the sticks. So you could certainly, well, handy also means convenient because you don't have to go far to shops for anything. Another word you could describe it as is congested, as you would have observed coming here. And of course, it has a fabulous industrial history, which it doesn't have now. It was called the workshop of the world, even into my living memory. Now we would have to. Now China is that. And of course they call their place Songwo. I can't think of any others.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, the audio, the quality of the audio doesn't matter so much, but if you just...
How do you feel about telling your story?
I'm quite happy to do it. I can't really say more than that. You're either happy to do it or unhappy to do it.
How do you feel talking about your past with strangers?
Yes, well, I wouldn't do it to absolute strangers in that way, but I might as well do it while I'm still around to do it.
Do you have any thoughts about how your story might affect the ideas and opinions about migration that people in Birmingham hold?
I didn't quite catch that.
Do you have any thoughts about how your story might affect other people? Do you have any thoughts about how your story might affect the ideas and opinions about migration that people in Birmingham hold?
I don't think it would have any influence whatsoever, because they come from their own different backgrounds and different situations. We came to escape what turned out to be 40 years of Stalinist repression. They will come from wherever they come from to escape some sort of repression or to improve their lot. That's the only thing we really have in common. We came to this country to improve our lot. Some of us succeed, some of us don't.
Mm-hmm. And what
Thank-
about other people's ideas of migration?
I haven't sort of thought about it. I know I would have difficulty migrating to somewhere like Australia or New Zealand. So if I had difficulties getting in there, I might have thoughts about it. But at my sort of age, it doesn't matter anyway.
Thank you.
We're always getting told about things being relevant. Now, of course, the high octane political thing is racism. Now, of course, I encountered that before the word was coined, because at the time our present Queen was crowned, some people sort of walked about a bit up Mount Everest and got to the top. And of course, this caused lots of land of hope and glory type stuff, of how wonderful it is to be British and all the rest of it, which it is really, but some people did overdo it a bit. So our class had two foreigners in it, me and an Australian kid. So the class teacher put one kid in front of the class who was English, with the blonde hair and blue eyes and everything, and then me and this Australian. And she sort of said that it's wonderful that the Englishman has gone to the top of Everest. And the Australian kid said, no, it wasn't. It was either a pig islander or a wog. And of course, Pig Islander is what the Australians used to call New Zealanders, which I think Sir Edmund Hillary was, or John Hunt, or one of those was. But of course, the one who really got to the top, I think, was the Nepalese person, which of course in those days were called wogs. So, yeah, we had our share of it then. And so the teacher would then say how wonderful it is to be British because this lovely blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid was very fortunate. And in a way, the Australian kid is as well because he's sort of in the club. As a colonial, he's in the club. He's not a pure foreigner. But of course, Richard here, he comes from a land over the seas which is much less civilized than we are.
This was a story of Ryszard from his school.